Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
(1944), West Mahanoy Township, Pennsylvania, became the home of a life steeped deep in pain and tragedy. Timothy Wayne McBride had just been born to Charles McBride and Fern Yost. Only a year later, the scene would be set for a winding trail of death and destruction when Charles left Fern and their 1-year-old son to fend for themselves. Chasing after jobs and trying to keep afloat, Fern moved Timothy and herself from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to establish a home and grow some roots before moving on to the next. Timothy would later describe his relationship with his mother, especially during these times, as cold and unaffectionate. But in 1950, some of that turbulent and unstable childhood changed. Even though Fern was still emotionally distant from her son, that wasn't always how she was with others. And when Timothy was around 6 years old, she married Bernie Krajcir. Bernie adopted Timothy as his own, but by the time Timothy had gained one stable parental figure in his life, he'd also already taken the first step down a very slippery slope. At the age of only 6, Timothy made his first acquaintance with the law when he was charged with his first crime. He'd stolen a bicycle, been caught, and with that came his first blemish on his criminal record. Only 4 years later, and things had taken a drastic turn from the relatively harmless to the beginnings of something extreme. Timothy began showing signs of obsession and possessiveness towards women, or more accurately, one woman in particular. Fern became the target for Timothy's sexual and emotional desires, further driving a rift between mother and son. Timothy acted out these urges in any way that he could. He started wearing feminine clothing and stalking other women. By the age of 13, Timothy had established himself as an exhibitionist who often got caught fondling and groping women on the streets. By the age of 17, Timothy had left home and appeared to be trying to correct his course. He joined the Navy as a cook, but his attempt to stay on the right side of the law did not last for very long. Only 14 months into his training, Timothy was dishonorably discharged for a crime that Timothy had become all too comfortable committing: sexual assault. Now, completely free of anything that could provide him with a sense of structure or even morality, Timothy was unleashed. One crime he later admitted to happened almost right after he was dishonorably discharged, and that was when he raped a woman in Waukegan, Illinois. He then stabbed his victim with a pair of scissors before leaving her to bleed out at the scene. The woman somehow survived, but her assailant was still free to strike again. That same year, Timothy attacked another woman in Chicago. His second victim also survived the attack, but this time Timothy was caught and convicted for rape and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years behind bars, but he would get out after serving only 14. In 1977, Timothy was released on parole, and he seized his newfound opportunity. On the surface, he played the part of the reformed inmate and bided his time. As part of the conditions of his parole, he enrolled in Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, where he studied administrative justice with a minor in psychology. This would turn out to be the perfect degree for anyone learning how to avoid being caught for any future crimes that they wanted to commit. Timothy then went on to study and then become an EMT, ambulance driver, then giving himself the perfect mask and the authority to hide behind to commit them. By day, he walked the streets, seemingly an upright citizen and reformed inmate. He was first a student and then an EMT medic. His colleagues became his friends, and both the men and women who knew him found him to be pleasant and charming. But by night, Timothy Krajcir was someone else entirely. He stalked the streets, often traveling to other cities to help muddle the waters and keep the authorities off the trail of his crimes. In 1977, that very same year that Timothy was released, he broke into a home in Carbondale and stole a .38 caliber handgun. He then later broke into another home where he attacked a mother and her 25-year-old daughter. He sexually assaulted the daughter before shooting both of the women in the head, killing them and eliminating any witnesses to his crimes. But one of his victims was a little closer to home. She was the 13-year-old daughter of one of his neighbors, and by 1979, Timothy had already been molesting her for over 2 years. When he was finally caught and arrested for sexually assaulting a minor, his EMT friends and colleagues could not believe that the Timothy Krajcir they knew would be capable of such a heinous crime. He told them that the girl had lied to him about her age, and they believed him. His friends all band together and posted his bail, essentially releasing a killer and a rapist back onto the streets. Timothy then seized his opportunity again. While out on bail, he attacked and killed 2 more women in Pennsylvania and raped a third. When he was found guilty for the child molestation charges, his former colleagues were beside themselves with guilt and shame. Almost unbelievably, Timothy was released only a year after sentencing. In 1980, his psychiatrist announced that he believed Timothy to be reformed and said that the only way to prove this theory was to put Timothy to the test. It's crucial to remember at this point in time that no one had connected the trail of bodies and assaults to Timothy. In fact, the authorities hadn't even pieced together that these crimes were being committed by the same person yet. Timothy had put all the knowledge he'd gained from his administrative justice degree to good use, but far from his intelligence, it was the lack of DNA technology that had actually kept him ahead of the investigators for as long as he would be. For the most part, Timothy only had to conceal his identity from his victims and keep variables in his MO for the authorities to think that maybe there was more than one killer out there. The closest they came to pinning everything on one person was when Timothy became known as the Blue Bandana Rapist. He often wore a blue bandana over his face when committing his crimes, and perhaps this marked the beginning of the end of him evading suspicion. Maybe spurred on by his success in eluding authorities so far, Timothy began to get careless. In 1982, he broke into a house wearing the same blue bandana. He then proceeded to rape a 34-year-old woman while her 10-year-old daughter watched. He then left and later attacked a 57-year-old woman in Cape Girardeau. He strangled her to death, but then left several strands of his own hair behind at the crime scene. Later that year, he killed another 65-year-old woman in Cape Girardeau. This time he left behind his blood, a palm print, and a bootlace that he'd used to strangle her, and even several of his skin samples were recovered under the victim's fingernails. Unbeknownst to Timothy, the noose was tightening. When he murdered 23-year-old Deborah Shepard, he would leave behind a clue that would unravel the long web of crimes that he had gotten away with so far. This time, the investigators recovered a sample of Timothy's semen from Deborah's shirt, and even though DNA technology had not reached a point where they could do very much with it, they saved and stored that sample, and the countdown began ticking. In 1983, when Timothy was 38 years old, the police found him sitting in his car holding a pistol, which was a direct violation of the terms of his parole. They arrested him, probably thinking that their job was done, but it was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, investigators had begun to connect the dots, and the technology was finally catching up to the point where they could start to prove that Timothy was guilty of so much more. In 2007, investigators ran Timothy's DNA against the semen sample recovered at Deborah Shepard's murder. The results were a match. When he was first confronted with this new evidence, Timothy denied this crime, but confessed the very next day. He still concealed his other crimes, but the other DNA samples he'd left behind over the short spree of his most heinous crimes were starting to catch up with him. When the victims' families announced that they would not be seeking the death penalty, Timothy Krajcir came clean. He confessed to the murders of 9 more women and at least 7 more sexual assaults. He was sentenced to 40 years for the murder of Deborah Shepard and another 40 for Virginia Lee Witt in Marion, Illinois. He then pled guilty to the murder of 5 women from Cape Girardeau and was given 13 consecutive life sentences. For once, it's pretty safe to say that Timothy won't be getting out of prison again. He is currently still serving his sentence at the Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois, which is a prison designed for inmates who need extra security or simply can't follow the rules of other prison systems. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If you like this episode, if you like 10-Minute Murder, please leave a rating and review any place that's possible. Spotify being one of the main ones. Apple, if you have an iPhone, you listen on Apple Podcasts. They've got a place you can leave ratings and reviews. Audible, a lot of people listen there. They have a place to do that as well. Any place that is possible, leave a positive feedback there, and it helps the show grow. You can go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to the podcast. A quick email question from someone that wants to remain anonymous. Joe, how long, I'm curious, does it take you to do each individual episode? Thank you. It varies greatly, anonymous person. It can be super short. Like I could possibly do all of it in one day. But then there are some that I've been working on for weeks. So there's really no right answer to that. The ones that take much longer are the ones with so much more information out there. For instance, I've been kicking around the idea of doing the West Memphis 3. And if you know that story, which you probably, if you're listening to the sound of my voice right now, you definitely know about the West Memphis 3. There's so much to talk about with that. And I've got a compact 10 minutes to do that. It's nearly impossible, but I'm definitely trying. I'm trying to figure out a way to do that. I haven't quite figured it out just yet, but probably sometime in 2024, you'll hear me talking about the West Memphis 3 in some capacity. Definitely, that's on my goal list for 2024, is to do an episode or whatever that happens to be on the West Memphis 3. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for listening to another 10-Minute Murder podcast episode. I will see you on the next one. Bye.